festivals that we have today in our world. It was there before too, but why are they essential?
Because I think, well, for many reasons. I mean, I go to several literary festivals, but there's something very distinctive about a poetry festival, a festival devoted just to poetry. For me, these are wonderful and they're rewarding. They're often quirky and they're oddball festivals as well. And I kind of like that. The fact that they're not about, the fact that you meet this incredible diversity of people, you hear this diversity of voices, but there's also a certain intimacy to the whole thing. I think that for me is the hallmark of poetry, that I think it's a reminder that we live in a world where we still need to hear the murmur, that everything is not just about blaring declarations and megaphones or just heated debate, that there's also room for a particular kind of articulation that allows for wonder, that allows for tentativeness. I think poetry makes all that possible, and poets need periodically to be affirmed as well, and to know that it's all right to be living these somewhat strange lives in times that would actually have us believe that we ought to be living otherwise.
Right. Do you think poets live in a parallel world, or what they see is really they exist?
Well, if what I said earlier sounded a bit like poets are sort of, I don't want to mystify poetry needlessly, but I also think it is true that it's the business of poets in some way to remind us of the fact that we inhabit complex worlds, we inhabit contrary worlds, we inhabit worlds where simultaneous realities exist, where there's room for sound as well as pauses. Poets are there to remind us of all that. So I don't think it's a parallel world as much as they inhabit the world that we all inhabit, we all do. But the effort of poetry, and I'm not saying every poet does this all the time, so I'm not trying to turn the poet into a shaman, but poetry as a form is about inhabiting this moment fully, deeply, and inviting the reader or the listener to that as well, So that's not an alternative world as much as a reminder that this very mundane world is magical.
How do you see the present world of poetry nationally and internationally?
When I started out Anindita, that is when I was this is in the second half of the 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, it was a somewhat bleak scenario as far as publishing was concerned in this country, particularly for Anglophone poetry, also for poetry in many other languages. Now, much has changed. I'm not saying publishers are crawling out of the woodwork, but poets are everywhere, and I think the online world has made that possible. And that's wonderful. So I think that's to be found all over the world, really. And we're seeing that happen. A certain democratization of poetry, which is great. And we're hearing lots of diverse voices. We're hearing younger voices. All this, I think, is to be celebrated. And my only concern sometimes is that we need to have space for all kinds of articulation. So there needs to be room for the louder voice, the performance poet, but there also needs to be room for the voice that chooses not to up the volume, that actually chooses to whisper. There needs to be room for all kinds of people and all kinds of poetry,
It's beautiful, yes, yes. So how connected are you with Kolkata, City of Joy, and what do you have to say?
Well, I've been to Kolkata about 3 or 4 times, not very often, and this time I'm returning after 10 years. So it's been, I came with a certain unexplained excitement. Now I'm not sure what that was about, but it must surely, I'm now looking back on this trip, I think it must surely have something to do with the fact that we had our first reading in Jorashanko in, just close to the home of Tagore. And the fact that today, as I told you, I went off to Belur Mutt, which is something I've always wanted to do. And it's probably the high point of my trip, apart, of course, from all these wonderful voices that I've heard and conversations that I've had. I'd like to come back.
No,
Yeah.
yes,
Thank
of course, we would be glad. Any messages for the festival, Chair Poetry Evening Poetry Festival that we had, and the organizers, because it was a vision. I've
know.
known, Sonia
Mhm.
and Tushar, they had this vision of doing this in Calcutta
Yeah.
and then bringing it.
No, I
this is the
think I'm
second
just
year.
full of awe at people who are actually able to pull off a poetry festival. It's a hard thing to do, and as I said, poets are quirky, and that's a sort of positive term for them. Sometimes they can be just insufferable. So to put them all together, get them going for 3 days, and keep them happy, and at the same time make sure that there's quality. There is a great deal of good poetry that we've heard over the past 2.5 days, and I think that's because it's curated by poets. I was also very struck by the fact that these are poets who keep themselves out of the programming. It's an important thing, I've done enough curatorial work to know that it's not always easy. Most people slip themselves in. They've chosen not to. They've chosen to allow other poets to be heard. I wish them all the very best with this, really. And I hope they will retain this intimacy of scale, because that is in many ways the strength of a poetry festival like this, that it doesn't turn vast and impersonal and sprawling, that it retains this kind of, that we have diverse spaces, but all of them have been warm, invitational spaces, So I hope it retains that scale.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anindita. Thank you.